All right, hello everyone, and welcome to our monthly Q&A session on the Ai&SCM Tech Talks community, where we share, learn, and we discuss professionally. Today we're going to be talking about trade, and our guest and subject matter expert is Babafemi J. Aderomo, who is the head of West and Central Africa Ocean Network Operations with AP Mola Maersk. Welcome, Jay, and confirm that you can hear me loud and clear.
Loud and clear, Adenka. Thanks for the opportunity and the platform to this opportunity.
Fantastic. All right. As we discussed earlier, we have 30 minutes to run through 8 questions pre-submitted and any other that we might see in the course of the conversation coming from LinkedIn one way or the other. All right, let's go right into it. I guess the first one is very topical, perhaps one of the most talked about subjects globally, with 2 major countries playing their part, the United States of America and China. All right, so this question is a rather long one, but it is what it is. So how do tariffs actually work, and how come it's such a powerful tool in the hand of the Americans? Can any country use it like they do? For example, China. Of course, both of them are. But please go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's a good question and a good cotton razor, like you mentioned. If we're all watching the news and seeing what's happening, this has dominated the airwaves. I think from last year up until this year. I think the way I can put tariffs for anyone out there, they are actually a pivotal economic tool for trade, right? And it's the import tariff that countries charge on the goods that come into their economy, either to balance the trade, but also generate revenue for the economy. I think the most important thing that everybody wonders, it's not like the concept of tariff is new. I think while this has gained a lot of airwaves is because it's perhaps the most aggressive and maybe unprecedented use of tariffs in recent times that we've seen, right? I think the word that comes to mind on why it's become such a very powerful tool for the US is leverage. And the leverage comes from the consumer market size that they have. We're talking of an economic GDP size of about USD 31 trillion alone in 2025. And when you look at that number, 60 to 70% of that is local consumer market, right? So when you put that leverage together, the US remains a market everyone wants to trade with. There's access to consumer base there. And lest we forget, right? We all trade globally in the US currency, meaning there is a lot of leverage. I think to the adjoining question, I know the saga has been between the USA and China, and the simple answer is yes, China can do so, of course, if they choose to, directly with the US. The cost of retaliations in specific sectors of trade, if they choose to. But if we marry back to what we think and what we see that China is trying to do, I think it's kind of likely with their strategy, which is to extend their trade relations with other countries, the non-US countries, which we've seen them already start building on. So if it's anyone's guess, I don't think China will probably go on an aggressive use of the tariff as we've seen, but it is a tool that any country can impose for the goods coming into their economy at any time. The key important factor is to understand the why How does this benefit your economy? How does it balance your trade? How does this build your local industries? But what I guess a lot of people are going to do, and we might get to it later down the line, it's more of finding new allies and finding new relationships and being tactful on how they approach.
Fantastic. Thanks for that context. It really helps to put it in perspective. I guess we're hearing in the news already um, the issues the Americans are having with Zimbabweans and Zambians. Of course, China has also thrown out their zero tariff opportunity to African countries. And you have the Europeans all visiting China lately. It's quite interesting. Everybody's going to China. All right, fantastic. Let's go on to the next question. Again, a rather long one, somewhat America related also. So, how are regional trade agreements evolving with the My Country First trend led by the USA and the rolling back of previously agreed environmental targets due to geopolitics? Are we seeing new agreements or modifications to existing ones? This seems to be a mix and match, but let's give it a go.
Well, I think another good question, and we've all heard about the Liberation Day, and as you mentioned earlier, I think what is emerging is new alliances, right? Resilience appears to be the word right now in the world of trade, both for governments and corporate organizations who run supply chains, solutions, and also working in trade, right? I think what we're going to be saying, and it's already playing out from the trips that you mentioned earlier on, is that while the US first approach is coming in, we will see the entry of the things that we're calling friendshoring, for example, where the countries are building new allies for trade. Of course, the existing trade relationships that are also existing at the moment, I think there will be a rethink of certain terms within them, given the balance of trade and where the leverage is sitting, right? We've also already seen, I think, in the news that the existing US-Mexico relationship, trade agreement relationship, there are discussions on how certain terms can be put in place to protect the region and to ensure that the trade agreement stays within the region, right? So we will see more of that new alliance building. We will see, we've already also seen in Eastern Europe, right, becoming an hub for organizations and companies who are trying to establish a base or grow their industries in Europe, right? So more and more of that, from where I sit, is bound to happen. And the ultimate message to keep in mind is that search for resilience, is that search for survival, but also forming new alliances for trade. And if we bring it back to the home front, right, I think it also speaks to where the Africa Free Continental Trade Agreement, right, comes into play, right? Because we will also need to have a trade bloc that is formidable enough to engage in further multilateral, bilateral relationships, either to build our local industries or to bring also value out to our exports. So I expect, as you mentioned, a lot of those trips, a lot of new alliances forming and the new ones coming in. As just quickly on the trips, if you look at the environmental factor, right, I think the work for now is survival, if I'm being honest. It is survival. I don't expect it to erode from my viewpoint, but I do expect it to be firmly put into the trade-off discussions that happens as countries come together, either to rework existing trade agreement or work on the new trade agreement. But ultimately, one thing that it's pivotal to put at the back of our mind is when it comes to environmental target, it is going to take more than just the government leading it. There are corporates, social responsibility angles that have to continue, which are already in play, and I expect those to continue. But the question mark will be on the speed and the acceleration of everything adding up.
Fantastic. I mean, what I hear you say is it's a game of survival, resilience. Everybody needs to, think of their country first. And right now, I mean, without tampering with the sanctity of signed contracts or agreements, everything is renegotiable. Everything is back on the table. We can renegotiate conversations and
Yes.
look for new partners if that's what it takes to survive.
Yes.
Sounds interesting. All right. We'll go to the next question, um, which is about steel trade. Uh, how is global trade adapting to the interplay between geopolitics and sustainability goals? Yeah, and this is a very interesting one. But we're beginning to see some countries roll back on targets that were initially set, again, just to survive. So, are carbon footprint and climate related targets still being honored? And do they still feature prominently in trade agreements?
Well, I think it's kind of interconnected to the earlier question, if I'm being honest.
Yeah.
And the viewpoint I would say is, of course, the geopolitics and the situation that we have now in the global climate does play a role, right? It's survival. I do, however, want to bring a perspective, right? The sustainability goals would not only be driven by government, the corporate organizations that work on global trade, have supply chains around global trade are actually equally responsible. And I think the commitment that I see from those organizations, not just in words but in actions, it's a reality. Right? We're seeing green ports, we're seeing green warehouses. We are working through, transitioning the fuel to more environmental friendly usage, right?
Yeah.
Globally. So all those parallel initiatives across the organization, because again, sustainability goes beyond, in my view, government initiatives only. What I do, however, it's anyone's guess, is how sustainable or how quickly can we speed up these activities and these initiatives that the corporate organizations are already engaging in, because they do need enablers on a policy perspective. They do need the trade agreement that's set in place to put the enabling policies and an enabling agreement that will eventually support the drives that these organizations are trying to make for us to have a more sustainable world. So I think the discussions, as we said earlier, it is going to boil down to survival. I expect, in my view, that the sustainability targets will continue to feature in those trade agreements. However, it's in the long run how quickly we can accelerate this on a global scale, because it takes everybody coming together to really address the climate challenges and place it right, left, and center. So it is going to be a trade-off of survival,
Mhm.
shared interests, and how the countries come together to still find a way to put sustainability in the considerations of the new alliances that are being formed, or even the revamp of the old alliances, basically.
Fantastic. Still, different types of alliances, the sustainability conversation is going to be, well, whether it's sustained is a separate conversation, but
Yeah.
survival seems to be the main thing. Shared interests, like you said.
Yes.
Thanks for that perspective. It helps to understand where we're going to. And while it continues to feature in contracts, it significantly depends on how governments, you know, come up with these agreements and how private entities who are going to be the main executors of those policies, play out.
I
Fantastic.
empower also. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So this is on African trade. So moving on from what seems to be or to have been lots of questions around global trade. Are there specific trends defining trade on the African continent? Is the trade surge or volume movement, if any, intra-African or intercontinental? That's so. Are we seeing more trade within the African region or between Africa and outside? So, for example, to and from China. China has been a major trade partner with Africa over the years, and I mean, in light of what has been happening in the past maybe 2, maybe 3 years, because we're talking trend wise now.
Well, I think the first perspective I would like to share, I think from an African perspective, is number one, we're still heavily an import dominated economy, right?
Yeah.
And one way or the other, that eats into, let me put it this way, how much of trade that we do intra-Africa. We still depend on import by local industries, but also finished goods and some raw materials that we use for our development and infrastructure projects. So if you put it in perspective, I would say imports into Africa is about 80, 85 total of the trade volume, and exports, I would say it's about 10 to 15% aggregate. Hello?
Okay, I lost you for a minute there, but I guess
Yes.
the
Yeah.
last I heard was 10 to 15%, something like that.
Yeah. So I think what I wanted to first establish is that, of course, we have a huge independence or dependence on imports into Africa at the moment. And I was just trying to set the baseline to that. What we ever seen, of course, with the after trade agreements and the tariff ramifications that are going on, there is a lot of intent from the countries to have the value add to the exports that they do from their countries at the moment, right? So I think
Right.
that's one of the key trends, right? Not just extracting the raw materials or the agri commodities, but what value can we actually within the continent generate to add value to the economy, to provide jobs, to create opportunities. And I think that will continue. And that is one of the growing trends that you will probably see across most African countries. There is an increased focus on how do we add value and how do we build forward. In terms of dependence and our relationship with China in terms of trade, I don't expect that to stop. There's still the economies of scale advantage that China offers globally. And in 2025, right, imports from China into Africa, we're talking about 30% growth in the market size, right? That means that relationship is still continuing, right? But what we're saying is a genuine intent driven by the Africa Continental Trade Agreement to now begin to build the digital, but also the physical infrastructure for a connected trade in Africa. And that is probably where I would say a lot of the proof points will be needed. But also, how do we extend our sourcing capabilities beyond China and also to build the resilience as the global stage is doing? But in my view, it is a connected block. I think after provides us that block to be able to form more bilateral relationships where needed. And I think it should be noted, I don't think any country uh, succeeds without some form of importation, right? Self-sufficiency is always good, but I think we still have a long way to go to the point where we're really able to grow our exports to the other countries within Africa, albeit it's growing, but there's definitely room for more in terms of the volume that we're seeing.
Fantastic. Thanks for that perspective. So The African Continental Trade Agreement gives us an opportunity to trade amongst ourselves. However, nobody can do without importing, but we're still largely import dependent. Yeah, and we continue to see trade with China
Yes.
while we build our capabilities or capacities to add value and stop exporting raw materials and raw, you know, inputs to the production process. Fantastic. Thanks for that perspective. The next question. Let's see whether this is also on trade. Ah, this is still somewhat on trade. I mean, well, it's all about trade today, anyways. So, but this is about China. So, this is China specific. Has there really been a reduction in global trade with China? So, everybody's been complaining about, we seem to have one, source or one major source. Remember, the World Trade Organization had actually mentioned that there's a need to diversify. So, has there really been a reduction in global trade with China? And is the China plus one resilience strategy a thing? Yeah. What has been the trend of global trade volume with China post pandemic? Yeah. Post the.
Wow. It seems to be a lot of China interested audience, right?
Oh, yeah.
Well, the way I will put it, right, and of course, from all the information filtering through, overall, China is still increasing their exports to countries globally. Actually, they are increasing their trade agreements and relationship with Europe, with the Southeast Asian countries, and Africa, like we mentioned earlier. What has really dropped in terms of China export is into the US, and I think we've spoken earlier about the tensions that are going there. But on the balance of it all, right, in 2025, the overall export for China to other countries grew by 5.5%, right? So it is growing, but there is a decline, evidently, about 20% in terms of what goes into the US, right? So ultimately, the China plus one strategy is all about the theme that we spoke about, right? The strategy, resilience, right? Building a more resilient trade relationship for countries. And it's opened up opportunities, as you can imagine, for countries like India, countries in the Southeast Asia bloc, who can also offer, the supply chain or the manufacturing capabilities that China has offered historically. So there is an increase still. The world is still trading with China. China wants to trade with the world. I mean, their Belt and Road Initiative speaks volume about that. So that is continuing, and complaints governments also are trying to, on the side, while the US-China trade relations go on, they're trying to build a buffer by expanding their relationship, and China is also trying to diversify. So there is growth still from China. Indeed, the China plus one resilience is a thing. It will take time, but that's the reality I guess every organization or even the trading partners are dealing with now to see who is our next ally, where can we strengthen our supply chain, and who can we work with that has the similar capabilities or offers us the same strategic intent that we want to achieve.
Fantastic. I mean, that's very clear. China plus one is real. It's a thing. Um, China is seeing growth in terms of trade volumes, and you know, people or organizations and or countries will continue to build necessary relationships to survive. And you know, let's watch it and see where it goes. The trend is a good one. Huh? I guess one very interesting thing is China is actually looking inward from what we are seeing too. So they're trying to
Yes.
increase local consumption, which is a very interesting way to approach this. All right, we're on question five. How are we doing with timing? Not too bad. 5 minutes to go, and three questions to go. Geopolitics. What are the implications of foreign investments from countries like China and the US on trade relations in Africa? So, what are the implications? Now, I'm not really pitting one of them against each other, but for us as Africans, what are the implications for us?
Well, I think even for advanced economies and countries, right, we all need investment, right? So it is a good thing, like you rightly said, it is a good thing. But what is important is how do we leverage it for our own economy? How are we building the infrastructure from these investments? How are we maintaining them and how are we harnessing them for the economy, right? Of course, the interests from countries looking to invest in Africa will continue to grow. There's abundance of raw materials, human resources, and that is the potential that we have, right? One of the typical strategy that we've seen is the Belt and Road Initiative that China has led with, where they are actually investing in infrastructure and connecting that, to the supply chain back home, right? I think for us, the implication is it's good that the investments and a lot of the companies and countries see opportunities in Africa. The goal is how do we retain it? How do we sustain it? Right? And I've said AFTA a lot. I think a lot is riding on AFTA. I
Yeah,
think it's a good initiative in my book. It's a good platform that the continent needs to kind of bring the whole continent into a trade block and increase our leverage and our ability to get the good deals when we go into this trade agreement. So I think that will be very important, ensuring that after moves into the stage where we can now begin to see the digital infrastructure, but also the physical infrastructure that can really move trade across Africa. I think this is where we benefit from it, and this is how we are able to add value to our own economy, I would say. So we've got to look out for our interests, I would say. The investments are welcome. It's how we sustain them, how we nurture them that will be important. We all know the renewable energy drive that is happening, the mining, the copper belt opportunities and the deals that are being signed there, right? I think it's just important that we find our seat at the table and, maybe who says no? An EV battery manufacturing plant in Africa. Who says no? But we have to put it on the table. Otherwise, it becomes an exchange of raw materials, leaving the continent, and then coming in expensive for us to use or to have access to as Africans, right? So for me, I think we need investment. It's very important, but we
yeah,
need to really, really now get together and see how we can build sustainable initiatives to really maximize those investments that are coming in now.
fantastic. The investments are welcome. Keep them coming, US and China. However, we need to trade amongst ourselves and build capacity. Fantastic. Thanks for that perspective. Um, two more questions. Uh, okay, yeah, two more. So this is a rather short one. Are supply chain disruptions being managed within regions? Very relevant. So, well, I mean, from where you sit and the opportunity to look at African trade and trade globally, particularly within the ocean, um, ocean line and shipping space. You guys probably have access to data that we've never probably seen before. So,
Well, I think thanks for that question. Right, I think the supply chain disruptions, as we all know, the geopolitical realities that are happening have all played a role in how fast goods move from one location to the other, and how easily you can source, at what costs, the tariffs come into play there? Can I still make profit? These are all concerns that every organization and the companies that have global supply chains are dealing with. I think there's a word that's been thrown around. It's resilience, right? It's and that has come to a stage where we see a lot of changes or diversification in the sourcing pattern. If you typically bought from supplier X, you're seeing more and more now considerations for supplier Y. Not only that, if you typically moved on ocean, do you want an ocean plus air freight supply chain solution readily in hand for you? All in the spirit of course, providing that resilience and ability to get the goods and the supply chain flowing. And I think tech is also playing a very big role in this, right? In the contingency planning, in the scenarios planning. By when are we going to go out of stock? By when do you need to, have an additional storage space? I think those are some of the things that is coming out now as a core need, not only from a supply chain perspective, but also from a supply chain and logistics service perspective, right? Typically, the customers expect us to be able to adapt to those realities that is happening. And now it's all about, if you had a plan A before, are there alternative routes that we can already put in place? Are there alternative solutions that we can already put in place? And what we mentioned earlier, right? It's also brought into perspective the concept of the nearshoring, the friendshoring, and also the reshoring, right? Because as the global stage dynamics changes, right? I think countries are also looking at what can we bring back home or closer to our allies, who can we form new ties with? I think those are some of the things that are being developed or have become the go-to strategy that organizations have to make the second nature. Whether they have those operationalized, I think the maturity level of the supply chain and the companies will play a role in that. And that is what I feel a lot of the global trade logistics service provider, they have a big task on their hands now to be able to adapt that for their customers also.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks, Emil. I was just checking there to see if we have any question from the LinkedIn audience. I've not seen any at the moment. As we go into the very last pre-submitted question, I guess the last one. Okay, this is also a mouthful. Is technology really reshaping regional trade practices with respect to the use of digital platforms and contemporary tools like blockchain? I know in one of those conversations that we had, the United Nations had talked about or had implemented or gave a use case example where blockchain helps to significantly reduce port congestion. Yeah, and this is it's not an African-based use case, but is technology really impacting what we're doing in Africa? So other than crypto and other finance-related instances, is blockchain being used to facilitate trade in Africa? Are there any known use cases in Africa?
Thanks. I think the answer is yes. The question is scalability. The question is scalability, right? Keep in mind, the world of trade is complex. There are multiple parties that need to have buy-in. There are regulations that need to align. So I think, as we can see on the screen, right, there are use cases. And from where I sit, what I worry about is, does it all add up in the end to really streamline the trade within Africa? There are use cases. And after like the ADAPT initiative, which is more of a digital passport to give credibility to African traders, I think that is very good. That increases our ability on the global stage. There are port integration systems in Eastern Africa, and most of the supply chain, let me say, stakeholders right now have one form of digitization initiative going on. I think that takes us back to the last time. What I worry from where I sit is the digitalization and the ecosystem part, just because of the sheer complexity of trade. So for me, there is proof points, definitely, right? And logistics, planning scenario, we have twin towers where you can, the digital twins, right? Where you
Yeah.
can almost mirror a scenario to understand the best solution to route your supply chain and all of that. All of that is available. But the broader question, especially when we come to the Africa perspective, is are we at a scale here? Who's taking the lead,
Yeah.
right? Are we all trusting that it's going to be after? And if it's after, of course, there are a lot of other smaller, let me say, enterprises coming up who are trying to attack or solve certain part of this fragmented supply chain. Who's running that governance? How does it all fit in, right? That is where, when I look at tech and how we can effectively use tech to reshape regional trade practices in Africa, that is where I think a lot of the work needs to be done. If you ask me, I think AFTA takes the lead in setting the pace, but it's the integration with all the other enterprises coming in, the port authorities, the corporate, the revenue organizations.
Oh, okay. I think, Jay, we just lost you for. Okay, you're back in. Let me make sure I'm able to get you back in. All right. Technology happened. We're talking technology and technology happened. Interesting. Okay, so I mean, you were rounding up on the tech conversation around um, use cases being present in Nigeria, sorry, not Nigeria, in Africa, and after taking the lead, that's the African Continental Free Trade Agreement taking the lead. Please go ahead.
Yeah, so I think for me, that has to be the anchor. Like I mentioned, there are use cases. There are multiple players involved in regional trade, and it's that integration that I worry about, right? So that we don't go into silos of developing solutions that never had up, right? So I can give you an example, a typical example. If you want to move, let's say, from one location to other in Africa, right? While one port of entry might be fully digitized, there's no point where you have to do a manual handover in the next node. So those
Yeah,
are the things that for me we would have to, of course, focus on, but also that's what's going to determine how much value we can get and how much integration we can truly get. And I feel AFTA is best placed to set that pace. And like I've said earlier, it's now time to put the digital infrastructure and the physical infrastructure in place, but not a short-term game. This is going to take time, right? This is
yeah,
going to take time, and this is where the vision and the roadmap comes in play in actually getting the best value out of trade. But I can tell you already, the global trade logistics service provider, things are digitized already. You can know where your cargo is, you can
Right.
see, you can access your finance, you can pay online. All of that is already coming. And some of the external stakeholders that have a role to play, be it the government agencies, bit and bit of it are all digitized already. The challenge, or I think the big challenge in front of all of us is how does it all add up, right? To the point where from where you sit, you can make a trade deal, it all connected, there are no paper trails, there is trust, there is integrity. Blockchain can offer that, but how does it all add up? 54 countries and counting, right? That have
Yeah.
those global ones. So that is where I feel we really need to think about.
Fantastic. I mean, it's a good place to to bring this conversation nearly to a close. Except there's any question within the studio. Okay, so there's a question within the studio. Tim, please go ahead. I think the mic should be open. Oh, you don't have audio. Let me see. Did you drop it in the chat? Okay. Connection glitch. Lillian mentioned a connection glitch. Are you able to put it in the chat, Tim? Okay. Let me see whether. Okay. All right. So I guess we can continue that conversation in the chats on LinkedIn. Yeah?
Yes, yes.
We can continue the conversation in the chat. Thanks, Tim. All right. I mean, that's a very good. I think one of the things that just struck me there is what's the use starting a digital original or initiating the trade from a digital origin and then the destination is entirely manual, and that's our reality. So it's going to be a while, but
Exactly.
yes. But the good news is that there are use cases, and it's gradually taking roots, and the markets are shaping or shaping up into not just the digitization conversation, but the reality of it.
Yes.
All right, thanks, Emil J. It's been a fantastic conversation for 42 minutes. A big thank you to everyone who made our time to, to put those questions together, particularly the long-winded ones that had a mix of, tariff and sustainability. Very interesting. But those, made it very, made the conversation very interesting for us, or very good for us. So thank you, everyone. We're looking forward to starting or having another conversation by the end of March, hopefully on automation. There's so many things that can be automated these days. That could be your specific processes or your manufacturing activities. So we will decide and then share the information and have a subject matter expert who has practiced or is currently practicing that particular type of automation. I guess the biggest thing now is agentic work. Maybe someone's gonna come on and share a bit of that, or I could also share a bit of some of the things that we've had done and are still doing. And that's about it for this month's edition. Thanks everyone for joining in, and thanks, Jay. Any final words?
Well, thanks for the platform. Keep it going, and looking forward to the subsequent editions and learning. Of course, you can see I'm passionate about Africa, so let's have the Africa angle also to what it means for us on the subsequent topics. I think it's a good one for us all. Thank you.
Thanks, Jay.